Okay, Grandma, I'm going. Just as I was about to dash out of the house, Grandma called me back. Turning around, I found Grandma smiling and holding a lunchbox. I suddenly remembered I had forgotten to pack it and, with a smile, got the lunchbox. This time, I loudly said, "See you," and Grandma waved. Goodbye. I used to always turn left at this alley, but today I turned right. I was so happy in my new shoes. Walking under the blue sky made my heart leap with joy. On this sunny day, I became a middle schooler. My name is Sophie, and I have lived with Grandma since I was little. If Grandma hadn't reached out to me then, I wouldn't be living so freely now. Back then, I felt incredibly alone. My mother, who usually picked me up from kindergarten, didn't come that day. Mrs. Anderson, with a forced smile, was the one who lifted me up as I waited endlessly for my parents. Mrs. Anderson took me to a large, white building. I didn't immediately realize it was a hospital. Someone was sitting on a chair there. When Mrs. Anderson slowly let go of me, with a tear-streaked, wrinkled face, gently embraced me. Afterward, led by wrinkled hands, I entered a cold, dark room where my parents were quietly sleeping. No matter how much I called out, they didn't wake up. At that time, I didn't understand much. But even as a child, I knew one thing. I would never see my father and mother again. That sadness was all that filled my heart. From that moment, my life began to change significantly. I started living with my maternal grandmother. She was the one who embraced me as I cried without understanding. Although Grandma lived on a pension, I never felt poor. Of course, there were times when I felt lonely. It wasn't until I was older that I realized Grandma did everything she could to entertain me. Our life was modest, but it was always filled with smiles. That's why I believe I can dive into this new life without fear. I am truly grateful to Grandma. I must say, my debut in middle school was very successful. I've always been good at studying and generally had good grades. I had good learning skills, and I knew that was one of my strengths. By helping the kid next to me with homework, I naturally made new friends. One friend after another, I was enjoying every day. Then, one day, we had group work in class, and we pushed our desks together to form groups. A topic for discussion was written on the blackboard, and we had to consolidate our opinions for a presentation. The first to speak up in our group was Laura. Her rapid-fire talk was as if she didn't want to give us a chance to speak. As we listened to her, amazed, she started to write her opinion on the paper for presentation. Taking advantage of that, I quickly stopped her and explained my opinion slowly for clarity. Then, gradually, everyone in the group began to share their thoughts. As we discussed noisily, time flew by. In the end, we decided to present an idea centered around my opinion. Encouraged to do so, I presented our opinion as the group's representative, albeit a bit nervously. The next moment, the classroom filled with applause. Mrs. Johnson smiled, saying it was a good presentation. Feeling embarrassed, I looked down slightly to avoid showing my blushing face. Back at my seat, everyone in the group talked to me with smiles, except for Laura, who looked at me coldly. Feeling scared, I averted my eyes from her. And the next day, my school life changed completely. Even when I greeted people as usual, no one responded. Everyone turned away from me, whispering to each other. Confused, a flashy-looking boy, who usually didn't talk to me, appeared in front of me. He came close to me with a sly smile, then opened his mouth wide. "You're just a poor orphan, aren't you?" That single sentence made my spine freeze. It wasn't something I was trying to hide. But his mocking attitude made it easy to guess why I was being ignored by my classmates. And who had started it? The boy, irritated by my silence, started blurting out the rumors. "Sophie is an orphan. She lives off her grandmother's pension, so she's poor. That's why she's always trying to steal other people's things." Because of these baseless rumors, my happy days crumbled away. I had never thought about stealing anything. Ignoring the boy in front of me, I glared at Laura, who was watching from a distance. She pointed at me and giggled with the girls surrounding her. I tried to boost my spirits, thinking I wouldn't let this harassment defeat me. I grabbed the arm of a friend who was trying to avoid me, attempting to convince her that the rumors were a complete lie. But the girls, who had laughed with me just yesterday, shouted, "Don't come near us," and pushed me away. Then they ran out of the classroom. I stood there stunned, as Laura's group laughed loudly. I remained frozen, unable to say anything in return. Only the spot where my friend had pushed me throbbed painfully. The following days were lonely. In the classroom, Laura and her group would come near me and taunt me. Gradually, there was no place for me in school anymore. I was afraid of those who mocked me and those who just watched from afar. With that fear, I couldn't stay in such school. Unable to bear the heavy stares filled with various emotions, I began to spend time alone. Though my world became quiet, the anxiety and loneliness didn't fade. During these lonely days, summer approached. But it didn't matter to me. The friends I was supposed to enjoy summer vacation with had all disappeared. Returning home from school with a heavy heart, I saw Grandma squatting near the flower bed by the entrance. As I tried to enter the house without speaking to her, she said, "Sophie, how was your school?" Even though I didn't respond, Grandma started talking about planting seedlings in the flower bed. "Summer is coming. I wanted to see beautiful flowers with you. I hope they grow straight and honest, just like you." Hearing Grandma's words, I felt a heat rising in my body. I wasn't the honest girl Grandma thought I was. I was just sulking and twisted, without the courage to face things head-on. I noticed Grandma sweating while planting the flowers but didn't care and was about to enter the house, ignoring her. "You don't know anything." I blurted out these words, and Grandma's eyes widened. But then, she smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I might have said something strange again. I'm really sorry." As I watched Grandma apologize, my face grew hot with emotion. I couldn't hold back my feelings any longer. "You don't understand anything at all. I would have been better off in a facility than being taken in by you." My emotions overflowed, not just in words, but in tears as well. Grandma, seeing me cry, approached me in a fluster. At that moment, she lost her balance. There was a small bag of fertilizer at her feet, which she slipped on. I understood what had happened, but I was too shocked to move. Grandma had fallen and was now groaning in pain, curled up on the ground. Even as I rushed over and tried to speak to her, she could only moan, unable to have a conversation. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, I hurriedly called an ambulance. While waiting for help, all I could do was rub Grandma's back as she lay immobile. Later, Grandma was safely transported to the hospital. According to Dr. Thompson, Grandma had broken her leg. Grandma, seemingly relieved by the medication and not in much pain, sheepishly explained to Dr. Thompson that she had fallen while tending to the flower bed. Dr. Thompson smiled, advising her to be careful, but soon turned serious as he examined her. It seemed the conversation wasn't over yet. Dr. Thompson, with a grave expression, began to discuss Grandma's health. He said that the damage to her knees and spine was beyond what one would normally expect. Moreover, it seemed she had also hurt her abdomen when she fell, and the pain warranted further tests, which revealed something concerning, necessitating a re-examination. Grandma, looking apologetic, drooped her shoulders at Dr. Thompson's words. Eventually, losing patience with Grandma's silence, Dr. Thompson questioned why she hadn't sought medical attention when she first felt pain. I stood there, dazed, my mind clouded with thoughts. How had I not noticed that Grandma's body was in such bad shape, despite living with her all this time? She was always smiling and seemed so energetic. Was her deteriorating health because of the hardships I caused? Did she endure the pain without telling me to avoid worrying me? At that moment, I was flooded with questions and remembered the terrible things I had said to Grandma. But I couldn't bring myself to ask these questions or apologize for hurting her. While I was still in shock, Dr. Thompson finished speaking. Grandma would be hospitalized not just for the fracture but until her health fully recovered. "I'm really sorry," Grandma apologized to me. I couldn't say anything back to her, hanging my head in sorrow. Grandma looked uncomfortable in my presence. She observed me closely and then asked if I could buy and gather the things she needed for her hospitalization tomorrow. Grandma, with a smile, suggested that the cheap supermarket nearby would be fine. I nodded in agreement and quietly left the hospital room. I couldn't bring myself to start another conversation. I felt like I didn't deserve to be with Grandma at that moment. The next day, I went to the budget supermarket, just as Grandma had suggested. I shopped, looking at the grocery list I had prepared the day before, and filled my basket with the necessary items. Then, from behind, I heard someone call out, "Sophie," and my body trembled. When I turned around quickly, there stood a boy from my class. I didn't remember much about him, but just the fact that he was a classmate made me break out in an uncomfortable sweat. "What a coincidence to see you here." "Typical for someone poor," he said as he approached me. I felt an indescribable fear towards him. Driven by the urge to flee, I forgot about the basket full of items I was holding and started to run. The boy chased after me, trying to catch me. Thinking about how I would be ridiculed if I got caught made it hard to breathe. It was hard to escape properly in the cramped store. "I'm going to be caught." Just when I thought that, a girl suddenly appeared, twisting the arm that he reached out to grab me. Although I should have just run away, I stood there, dumbfounded, watching the scene unfold. The girl frowned at the boy, who was bothering a girl he didn't know, and he yelled at her to let him go, claiming it was a misunderstanding. Upon seeing the boy's attitude, the girl laughed confidently and scoffed. "Who do you think you're speaking to so arrogantly?" Hearing her assertive words, the boy fell silent. Then, as he seemed to resign himself, he politely asked her to let him go, and she released his hand with a satisfied smile. Afterward, she turned around and asked me if I was okay. At that moment, tears started to fall from my eyes. I was always alone at school. Additionally, I had said terrible things to my only family member, my grandmother, and hadn't been able to apologize before she was hospitalized. At that time, I had no emotional room to spare. Hearing words of compassion for the first time in a long while. The tears I had been holding back overflowed at their warmth. In front of me, crying without saying anything, the two exchanged glances. Then, perhaps out of concern for me, they helped me complete my shopping according to the list I had and took me outside. After leaving the supermarket and finally calming down, I thanked them and tried to leave. But they insisted on following me because they were worried. The classmate was Kevin. The misunderstanding was cleared up by Emily. She looked very mature, but apparently, she was in a different class, but the same grade as me. When I explained that I was going to visit my hospitalized grandmother, they encouraged me and said to let them know if there was anything they could do to help. The two seemed to be childhood friends and looked very close to me. I heard that Kevin and Emily have been in the same basketball club since they were kids, and that Kevin has never played basketball better than Emily. I couldn't help but laugh when I heard that story. It turned out the exchange in the supermarket was about how he had never won against her, yet he dared to speak to me that way. At that moment, Emily looked surprised. Wondering what was going on, she finally asked me what Kevin had done to me. Kevin, while being glared at by Emily, explained that he was just casually greeting me as a classmate. Watching them, I found myself talking. It seemed I had angered Laura and was being teased in class. I was always running away because I was afraid of the stares from my classmates. Come to think of it, this might be the first time I've ever talked about this to someone. After I finished speaking, Kevin seemed to realize my feelings. Then he apologized, saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't think it through." It seemed Kevin, busy with club activities, had been avoiding getting deeply involved in the problems occurring in his class. His words in the supermarket were just him trying to say hi after hearing a simple rumor that I was poor. Realizing that Kevin's words had no deep meaning, I also apologized, saying, "I'm sorry for running away suddenly." Kevin smiled and assured me that it was completely fine. As I felt relieved, Emily gently held my hand. Surprised, I looked at Emily, who was looking back at me with a strong, direct gaze. Seeing my confusion, Emily suddenly smiled and said, "From now on, everything will be okay." Honestly, I didn't understand what she meant, but her words lightened my heart a bit. Then, after chatting happily with them, we reached the hospital, and I parted ways with Kevin and Emily in front of the hospital, feeling it inappropriate to take them into the ward. I watched their backs until they were out of sight and then hurried to my grandmother's room. When I opened the door, my grandmother greeted me with a smile. As I put away the things I was told to bring, she looked at me and smiled happily for some reason. When I wondered why, she asked if something good had happened. I felt a little startled, but when I talked about the two people I met today, my grandmother smiled even more happily. Contrary to her energetic appearance, it seemed she would need to stay in the hospital over the summer. As she said, "I won't be able to see the summer flowers," with a slightly sad smile, my heart tightened. After talking with my grandmother for a while and saying I would come again, I went home to find the flower bed just as it had been that day. The sunflower seedlings by the flower bed had wilted and fallen over. I stared at them for a while, then firmly replanted them in the flower bed, wishing for them to grow straight and bloom beautifully. And I reminded myself that I also needed to properly apologize to my grandmother. Living alone was not an issue for me. I could do household chores, and as long as I managed my finances, there wouldn't be any trouble. But with no relatives nearby, I was unsure what to do. For the time being, I only informed my paternal grandmother, who lived far away, and my homeroom teacher, Mr. Wilson, by phone. The next day. From that day on, I was no longer alone. When Laura's friends were about to tease me as usual, Kevin, from my class, suddenly started making a one-liner joke off the cuff. Everyone's attention turned to him, and the atmosphere of making fun of me disappeared. Moreover, Emily, who was supposed to be in a different class, started coming over, and we often ate lunch together on the rooftop. I soon realized that both of them were protecting me in their own ways. When I thanked them, they just brushed it off with a smile, saying they simply wanted to be friends with me. Still, I was always grateful to them. But this peace didn't last long. During a re-examination while she was hospitalized, it was discovered that my grandmother had developed a gastric ulcer. Fortunately, there was no bleeding, and she needed to fast and be on an IV drip while being monitored. Although my grandmother and Dr. Thompson were relieved that there was no perforation and laughed it off, I was filled with anxiety. When I got home, I looked up gastric ulcers on my phone and felt a pang in my heart when I read that stress could be a cause. My grandma's health problems. I can't help but feel they are my fault. Alone in my house, I curled up, feeling the emptiness around me, and waited for morning to come. The next day, perhaps noticing my pale complexion, Emily invited me to talk on the rooftop after school. I thought that talking to her might lighten my mood, so we went to the rooftop together. Just then, unexpectedly, Laura approached us hastily from behind. I wondered if she had been following us. Laura, with no regard for manners, suddenly grabbed Emily's arm. Stunned and unable to speak, I watched as Laura glared at me and opened her mouth wide. "You know what? Just because you're poor, doesn't mean you can cozy up to Emily, who's rich. It's pitiful to see Emily being associated with someone like you." I felt dizzy hearing those words. I had no idea that Emily was wealthy. Was she approaching me just to spread rumors with Laura that I was sucking up to the rich? While I was lost in these thoughts, Emily shook off Laura's hand. "What are you even saying? I'm with Sophie because I want to be. Aren't you embarrassed by this behavior?" With Emily's firm words, Laura couldn't say anything more and walked away dejectedly. Surprised yet grateful, I thanked Emily for her help. Emily, looking straight at me, then smiled broadly. "I really wanted you to know everything," she murmured, and began to share her story. Emily shared that she had lost her parents when she was young. Now, she lived with her grandparents. Emily's grandfather was the president of a company. Originally, her father was supposed to take over, but her grandfather was still actively managing the business. Emily also shared her dream with me. To take over her grandfather's company as soon as possible. That was her dream. "I'm sorry for bringing this up so suddenly. But I wanted you, Sophie, to know properly. I think of you as my best friend." As she said this and smiled shyly, tears naturally started to fall from my eyes looking at her, Emily. To think that someone considers me, just as I am, their best friend. Quietly crying, I felt Emily gently pat my back. Through my blurred vision, I looked at Emily. I realized I didn't want to keep any secrets from her. Wiping away my tears, I confessed to Emily how I had said awful things to my grandma that day. Emily listened silently to my clumsy story. After I finished, she clearly told me that I would regret it if I didn't apologize properly. As I said yes, she said, "Let's go," and took my hand. Confused, I had no choice but to follow her. She led me to a shopping district. There, in front of a flower shop in the district, Emily finally stopped. The flower shop was manned by Kevin. Surprised to see us, he shared that this shop was his family's business. I took a deep breath to muster courage and asked Kevin for a flower. Kevin looked surprised again but wrapped and prepared it carefully. As he handed me the flower, he asked where I was going. I replied that I was going to the hospital to visit my grandma, and he smiled, wishing me to take care. When we reached the hospital, Emily pushed me forward with a smile. I nodded quietly and headed to my grandma's room. I knocked softly and opened the door to find Grandma looking at a photo. It was a picture of my parents, which she had asked me to bring. Seeing her sad, distant gaze, I took another deep breath and entered the room. Grandma, surprised as if she hadn't heard the knock, quickly hid the photo under her pillow. Then she smiled as if nothing had happened. I wondered how long I had been making Grandma overexert herself. Feeling my heart beat faster, I presented her with a sunflower, her face filled with wonder. Then slowly, I began to say the words I had always wanted to say. Grandma, I'm so sorry for the terrible things I said that day. I was so happy with you. I want to stay with you. So please, from now on, don't push yourself too hard and rely on me. After I finished, the hospital room fell suddenly quiet. Grandma didn't say anything. When I looked up, Grandma, tears streaming down her face, took the sunflower from my hand. Grandma always thought of Sophie as still a small child. The more I tried not to worry you, the more I ended up hurting you. I'm truly sorry. Then Grandma and I hugged each other and cried out loud. Although scolded by a nurse who heard the commotion, Grandma and I just looked at each other and laughed. Then, a busy summer vacation passed. I spent most of it caring for Grandma. Yet, I felt happy that she was relying on me. On the last day of summer vacation, Grandma returned home. Since she promised not to endure pain and hardship silently anymore. She said she would go to the hospital regularly and ask me to share in the household chores. Days of laughter with Grandma returned, and I felt truly happy. As our life together resumed, school also started today. On the first day of the new term, Grandma sent me off with a smile, saying, "Have a good day." Kevin and Emily were waiting for me at the front door. Especially Emily, my truly beloved best friend. Called by Emily and Kevin, I ran out. Near the entrance, the sunflowers in the garden, now fully grown, shone brightly in the sunlight.